Good evening and welcome to our committee meeting for Ad Hoc Budget Advisory Committee. We have no closed business today, so we will jump right into opening and convening an open. The recommendation is that Council convenes an open session at 5 p.m. May I have a mover? Moved by Councillor Cressman, seconded by Councillor Wilkinson. All those in favor? And that passes unanimously. Thank you. And I will pass it over to Councillor Sadhu for the land acknowledgement.
We have gathered in Wilmot Township on the traditional terry of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, and Mississauga peoples. We also want to acknowledge the importance of the Dish with One Spoon Covenant, a peace agreement made between the Indigenous nations before the Europeans arrived. It characterizes our collective responsibility to each other and Mother Earth. We should take only what we need, leave enough for others, and keep the dish clean. By acknowledging this covenant, and the First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples, we are reminded of our important connection to this land where we live, learn, and work together as a community.
Thank you. There are no additions to this evening's agenda, so the recommendation is that the agenda as presented for February 21st, 2023 be adopted. May I have a mover? Moved by Councillor Sadhu, seconded by Councillor Martin. All those in favor? And that passes unanimously. Are there any members who have a disclosure of pecuniary interest they would like to declare? Councillor Dunstall?
Thank you, through you, Mayor. I'm not sure if this is something that needs to be declared, but I did notice that there's work in the budget for Morningside, and as I live there, I thought that may be an issue, so I wanted to put that on record.
Okay, thank you very much. Now, for minutes of the previous meetings, recommendation is that the minutes of the following meeting be adopted as presented in the agenda package for February 13th, 2023. May I have a mover? Moved by Councillor Sadhu, seconded by Councillor Martin. All those in favor? That passes unanimously. We have no presentations or public meetings this evening, and we also have no consent agenda. So I will now introduce Sharon Chambers, our CAO, and Patrick Kelly, our Director of Corporate Services and Treasurer, to provide some opening remarks.
Thank you and good evening. Tonight, staff will be presenting the first draft of the 2023 capital budget, which includes 61 projects totaling approximately $23.7 million in capital expenditures. This amount greatly exceeds the historical capital spending by the Township over the past 15 years, with the highest annual expenditure of approximately $14 million occurring just last year in 2022. The increase is partially attributed to high inflation impacting the cost of projects and growth, with several critical infrastructure projects needed in order to service future residential and employment land developments. These projects will be funded primarily through development charges and will require debt financing until the development occurs and development charges revenue can be collected. Careful analysis will be required in order to ensure the Township is able to service the debt payments within the DC Reserve Fund. As we discussed in the previous meeting, we don't have sufficient reserves to borrow internally to bridge the debt until DC revenues are collected. Similar to the approach when staff presented the 2023 draft operating budget, staff is not seeking approval tonight of the capital budget. The draft capital budget is presented for discussion and consideration by Council only at this time. And as discussed when we presented the operating budget on February 13th, the past practice would have been for staff to make adjustments to the capital program in order to achieve the Council-approved target levy increase. However, we're changing the process this year to allow Council to provide direction on the priorities for the community. With that being said, deferring capital projects will not necessarily reduce the tax levy impact. In order to reduce the tax levy impact or the operating budget increase, Council will have to focus on those projects that are funded through the annual tax levy. As Council will remember, the operating budget contains approximately $1.4 million in levy funding toward the capital program. By deferring a levy-funded project, Council could reduce this annual allocation and therefore lower the tax increase. However, as we also discussed at the last meeting, deferring projects comes with a risk, and it can create that bottleneck that we spoke of. The risk can be further deterioration or failure of the asset, increased costs by pushing them down the road, rising interest rates, all of which we are experiencing in this 2023 budget. Of the 61 projects presented this evening, only 27 are fully or partially funded through the levy, and the remaining 34 are funded completely outside the levy. To help with the discussion, staff have prepared a summary of the capital projects by department, which you will see before you, and the levy-funded projects are shown with an asterisk. So following the presentation of the reports by Director Kelly, Chair Salonen will go through the capital program department by department, and Council can ask questions or provide direction to staff as you see fit. Staff are here and ready to answer questions related to the projects. If during the discussion Council would like to consider the deferral of a project or projects, staff can track that, and Clerk Bunn is ready to do so. And he will prepare a motion at the end of this meeting to be considered, and if needed, we can separate that motion to vote upon those projects separately. As a reminder, every decrease of $100,000 amounts to a 1% decrease in the levy. And with that, I will turn it over to Director Kelly to present his reports. Thank you.
Thank you, CAO Chambers. So before we get into the reports, I just thought I'd take the opportunity to provide some additional context on the capital program for both committee and the community. So you can go to the next slide. I wanted to begin by putting the entire forecast into context where, in theory, the capital program is the outcome of a series of different planning exercises that help establish priorities for each service area. It starts ultimately with our official plan, which sets out the land use policy directions for long-term growth and development within the municipality. Next is the strategic plan, a far-reaching document expected to help inform municipal decision-making for 20 years or more. With each term of council, this document is reviewed and redefined to ensure it's up to date with the ever-evolving community needs. Staff, we look forward to the update of our strategic plan with this term of council. That's a part of this capital program. Each service area also undertakes master plans and studies on a periodic basis to ensure our corporate goals are being achieved in the most efficient and effective way. Finally, our township's asset management plan is a legislative requirement in place that aims to help us maintain our assets at appropriate service levels by applying the right intervention to the right asset at the right time. Each of these plans sets forth direction for capital investments for the current year and over the longer-term planning horizon, and should be tied to a specific, each project is tied to a specific outcome or desired service level within one or more of these plans. Next slide. I wanted to provide some contextual information on what the capital program is. So in Wilmot Township, our capitalization threshold is currently set at $10,000, meaning that one-time initiatives that are estimated to exceed $10,000 are considered part of our capital program and fall outside of general operations. Council and committee are tasked with reviewing and approving the current year, in this case the 2023 capital program, while endorsing and supporting the forecast for the remaining 9 years. New initiatives within that forecast will not be approved until, or will not move forward until Council has approved them within year 1 of the forecast. In some cases, there are multi-year initiatives that do receive pre-budget approval, which may commit a portion of future years' funding and capital spending. Next slide, please. Capital investments support service delivery and achieve desired outcomes. Looking back to the Township strategic plan, master plans, Council helps to define that service delivery and the desired outcomes that we follow. Staff utilizes the high-level Council-approved plans to shape our capital forecast. The greatest challenge we have in capital planning that Council has is to determine the optimal distribution of those capital programs across multiple service areas. Each department will provide strong cases for why their projects are justified within the current year, but Council needs to determine if all projects can move forward. The investment decisions that are made today have a direct impact on future operating budgets and on the Township's infrastructure reserve funds. Next slide, please. Staff look to the strategic plan to inform our capital program, and as I said, we look forward to the upcoming strategic plan update, where Council will bring forward the community's desires and reaffirm service level expectations in Wilmot. We continue to update the capital forecast throughout the calendar year and present to this Budget Committee annually with updated scope, cost, and timing of projects. In the perfect world, we'd move forward with all capital initiatives, as they truly will help our community reach our collective goals and objectives. However, our ability to fund this program through a mix of internal and external resources has significant impacts on the decision-making process. As a community poised for growth, the funding and financing options undergo extensive analysis to ensure our program is sustainable over the long term. This next slide just is a brief depiction of all of our owned infrastructure. It might be difficult to see there, but essentially it just showcases the volume of infrastructure that consists in Wilmot Township that we're responsible for maintaining and renewing. As the slide depicts, our single largest infrastructure investment is the road network, with over $224 million of owned infrastructure. Having said that, the combination of underground infrastructure assets, water, sanitary, and stormwater total just under $250 million. The remainder of our assets are township-owned buildings and facilities, including the recreation complex, fire stations, and this administration building, totaling over $35.5 million. The Township's capital program is utilized to ensure our infrastructure renewal and new infrastructure investments are managed efficiently and effectively. Next slide. The capital program is made possible via funding and financing. Funding represents the sources of dollars available, while financing represents the timing of receipt of those funds. Our main sources of funding in the capital program are through external grants, development charges, user fees, and ultimately the general levy. Each of these sources can have a variety of timing impacts associated with them. So grants can be received in a full payment up front, like the Canadian Community Building Fund or Ontario Community Infrastructure Fund, whereas other grant funding programs, we don't receive funding until we've incurred the costs and submit claims. DCs also can come directly from the DC reserve funds if they're in a positive position, which they aren't currently in Wilmot, or they come through long-term borrowing, which we speak to at length in these reports. User fees and general levy dollars can be sourced from current year taxation and current year user fees, or transfers from our infrastructure reserve funds, or long-term borrowing or debentures if necessary. The mixture of funding and financing help the Township to move ahead with projects and initiatives to meet the service level expectations and desired outcomes from the community. This next graph is just it's within the report when we get to the 10-year. It does show the mix of funding sources we have in the Township. Our main goal is to keep the bottom level, which is the current year tax one, on a steady increase, contributing more current year tax dollars annually to our capital program to make it more self-sufficient. We also rely heavily upon our infrastructure reserve funds, which this council has continued to support investments in going forward. But you can see a large portion within the next few years is going to come from external sources, being grant funding programs and the development charges set up. This chart, I guess, underscores the criticality of our dedicated infrastructure levy and annual adjustments to the capital program to keep it sustainable. Next slide, Chad. This slide is a quick update on the status of debt within Wilmot Township. We currently have close to $9.5 million of debt outstanding. The majority of that is DC funded debt with an annual repayment of $470,000. Our levy funded debt is at $185,000 annually, and local improvement funded debt for the St. Agatha water system at $155,000. I also noted on this slide the annual repayment limit, which is set by the Ministry of Municipal Affairs and Housing, is currently at $4.7 million. That $4.7 million would need to be funded through one or multiple of those sources: levy, DC, or user fees. We are, next slide, planning for the future by continually investing into our infrastructure reserve funds. This slide just gives a brief breakdown of where those investments are within the current year budget to roads, equipment, and facilities, and then user pay reserve funds going to water meters, and sanitary. So just to wrap up, some considerations of committee when you look into capital projects or the capital program as a whole. There is consideration, as CAO Chambers mentioned, about reducing or deferring capital, but it should be noted that that'll have a limited impact on the general levy, as most of our projects are funded through a combination of reserve funds, which is money collected in previous years, or long-term debt, which is money that'll be collected in future years. Other projects are funded through development charges, grants, etc. So when considering adjustments to the capital program, you should be looking at which funding sources they have and consider the longer-term impacts of those adjustments. I won't speak more about the infrastructure reserve, that's the next slide, infrastructure reserve fund transfers, just to say we appreciate this committee's understanding of the importance of that piece of our budget. That's it for my general contextual overview, so I'll hand it back to you, Mayor Sullivan.
That's great. Thank you very much, Director Kelly. So we will jump into the reports, and we will first get the recommendation for item 11.1, which is the 2023 capital program draft, COR-2023-16. And the recommendation is that report COR 2023-16 outlining the draft 2023 capital program be received for information purposes. To get this on the floor, may I have a mover? Moved by Councillor Cressman, seconded by Councillor Dunstall, and I will now turn it back over to Director Kelly to introduce this report.
Thank you, Chair Salonen. I'll speak for a lot shorter instance here and then hand it over to committee for questions, but if you can go to the second slide, Chad. Our 2023 program is funded for, as CAO Chambers said, $23.7 million. 1.43 million of that is from the current year property taxes, which is shown in the blue color on this slide. The largest proportion of funding is sourced from development charges at $9.1 million. The majority of that will need to be debt financed if it moves forward, and staff are undertaking further cash flow analysis prior to the issuance of this debt that was outlined within the report. Levy-funded debentures represent $4.3 million of funding. However, $1.7 million of that was already issued in the fall of 2022 for Bridge Street Bridge. So $2.6 million would be new debt in 2023. It was mentioned at our last meeting about the amount that we're contributing to infrastructure reserves versus how much we're drawing out. 2023 does anticipate us drawing a larger amount out of infrastructure reserves than we're putting in. We're slowly growing our annual transfers to get to a point where that switches to putting more in than we're taking out. And then finally, we'll receive external grant funding from the Canada Community Building Fund, Ontario Community Infrastructure Fund, which are both formula-based programs, and then the Investing in Canada Infrastructure Program and Municipal Museum Assistance Program, which rounds out our funding requirements for 2023. Within the staff report, I do go into greater detail about the impacts of recently announced cuts to OSIF funding, and you can see that we're trying to get through this year without an additional impact on the levy of that cut, but if they continue, that's going to have a direct levy impact. Next slide, please, Chad. This slide just shows the majority of capital spending that's coming from two main service areas, being infrastructure services and community services. All staff here on the corporate leadership team, as well as departmental staff, have put together justification sheets describing each project and the rationale for moving forward with them in 2023. We are here, as CAO Chambers said, to seek feedback and direction from Council on the various capital projects being proposed, and with that I'll hand it back to Chair Salonen.
Thank you very much, Director Kelly. So now we are going to open the floor for questions of committee. We are going to do this in the order you all have, I believe, your papers, and we're going to go separately by each department. So I'll call on the department. If you have any questions of their capital projects, then please let me know. If you have questions for another department, wait until we get there. Councillor Dunstall, are you good with that? I just know that you're virtually joining us. Yep, okay, great. So we will start off with the CAO's office. which has the 3 proposed initiatives. Are there any questions on these? Councillor Dunstall? Oh, you're just muted.
I know. Is that good?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. When I was knocking on doors while I was campaigning, I heard 2 or 3 things that came up over and over again. The most prevalent was the Prime Minister's path. The voters felt that it had not been transparent and that their voices were not heard. I would like to ask through you, Mayor, to put a motion through to have current council review all documentation for the Prime Minister's path that was public and that was private prior to us making any decisions moving forward.
I'm just going to pass it over to CAO Chambers to respond.
That's quite an ambitious request because I think there was a stack of boxes in my office when I got there that was taller than I am. Of course, that might not be saying much. So rather than reviewing all the documentation, what I would suggest is that I bring back an update report to council for your consideration. I know, this council was not here during that project. And the project that you see before you on the capital justification sheet is based on the recommendation that was in the First Peoples Group report. So that is proceeding with that. If council wishes to have some discussion on that direction, then I think it would be appropriate for me to bring that back through a report back, and then council can confirm that direction with me.
That would work very well. Thank you.
Great. Any follow-up questions, Councillor Dunstall?
Nope, that's it for that one.
Okay, thank you. Councillor Cressman.
Just to clarify, you didn't need a motion on that. That was just direction, or do you want me a seconder on that? No.
Through you, Mayor. Yes, we would need a mover and a seconder. I assume Councillor Dunstall will be the mover, and we'll be looking for a seconder on that.
I would second that.
Okay, so it has now been moved by Councillor Dunstall, seconded by Councillor Cressman to give the direction for CAO Chambers to bring back a report to this council so we can decide going forward direction to give staff again. So all of those in favor of that going ahead. Okay, and that passes unanimously. Any additional questions under capital initiatives in the CAO's office? Okay, seeing none, we will move along to the capital initiatives in corporate services. Any questions here? Councillor Wilkinson?
Yeah, through you, Mayor. With regards to the hardware and network infrastructure upgrades, I mean, I can see further down the line there's been a plan to start migrating data over to more of a cloud-based service. I guess my true concern and question here is surrounding the total dollar amount that we're prepared to invest into network infrastructure and computer hardware, given that we're slowly transitioning away to a cloud. I mean, is this absolutely necessary and something that we must undertake?
Through your Mayor Salonen. So to answer your question with respect to the cloud aspect, I think this is looking at our local infrastructure server hardware. Looking at the long-term planning, I don't believe there was a entire shift into the cloud. This component of with respect to the server side of this capital justification sheet is just looking at having a consultant look in and to design an appropriate server that would look at our future needs and consider those aspects of cloud impact. So we're not doing any direct capital purchases on a server per se. A component of this project is to look at that long-term planning aspect of that.
Any follow-up questions,
So
Councillor?
just to be clear, we want to spend $50,000 on a consultant to find out whether or not we should be moving to a cloud-based system?
No. So, through Mayor Salonen, no. So that's just a component of the project. Other components of the project involve our general PC replacements. Sorry, I have another. PC replacements, extending the warranty on our servers as well. So it's not exclusively $50,000 just for a consultant to look in at that. In fact, it's a very small component of that project.
Okay. Yeah, very good.
Any other questions, councillors? Okay, seeing none, we will move along to fire services capital initiatives. Do we have any questions for the chief? Councillor Cressman.
So this goes back to our purchase of Neville Street, is it 23? I think so. The Alpine Building, as I always called it. So I was surprised to find that the part of the capital purchase wasn't attributed to fire services, if that's where we're going to be putting a fire station at some point in the future. I see the out years in the 10-year capital budget having the construction of that, but I was figuring I would see a portion of the 3.5 attributed to fire services. So I don't know if that's a Patrick question or not.
Sure. Through you, Chair Salonen, I believe what you're referring to is going to be within the community services section of projects. However, it was added within community services just over the course of the last couple of weeks when the purchase of that property came to fruition. It is funded fully by development charges. Staff would be dividing up the proportion of funding that's coming from fire services development charges and parks and facilities development charges at the time of funding it. The key with getting it into the program for this year and indicating it was DC funded was to get it into the program. We'll determine what amount comes from fire and parks and facilities prior to finalizing.
Any follow-up questions, Councillor Cressman? Nope. Councillor Dunstall, did you have your hand up? Please go ahead.
Thank you, through you, Mayor. I just wanted to reiterate because I'd had this conversation before, for the replace Rescue 637, that was actually scheduled to be part of the 10-year plan, but my understanding is because pricing was going up so quickly and there was a problem with supply chain, that we felt that it was best to take that on, purchase it now for delivery in 2024. I just want to verify that.
Through you, Chair Solomon, it's the purchase was made last year with the previous council to incur some significant savings. So both those rescues were purchased at the same time with the financing this year for Station 3. Both will be delivered this year in May. They are on schedule for delivery for both Station 1 and 3.
Okay, so just to make sure I understand, though your order has been placed, we just haven't paid the bill.
That is correct. Correct.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Any follow-up questions, Councillor Dunstall? Okay. Any additional questions for the fire capital? No? All right. Then moving along to capital initiatives for infrastructure services, which is a big part of the capital budget here. Any questions, councillors? Councillor Sadhu.
Through the mayor, for the roadside mower and the sidewalk clearing unit, how much would it be if we source out those services instead of buying the equipment?
Through you, Chair, for the two, I guess, operational programs, the roadside mower unit is, first I'll explain that situation, I guess, as far as that piece of equipment. So it's a more challenging piece of equipment to replace or rent out type of thing. If we were to tender out the services, I don't think we would see the same quality of service that we have right now in terms of control of timing and the work that we do with the piece of equipment. So we haven't necessarily looked into, we'll say, a contracted service for that particular particular service. For the snow removal for sidewalks and winter control. So we do currently have a contract for our settlement areas. The unit rate that we receive for that contract is fairly, it's competitive, but it's fairly steep in terms of what we pay. We pay our contracts based on a level of service on a monthly basis, so it's a guaranteed level of service rather than sort of an hourly rate. And we do see a rate in between $4 and $5 per meter of sidewalk. If we were looking to contract some of that service out, then we would probably see in the 60 to 80,000 range per year for that service to be contracted out.
So long-term, it's a lot cheaper to buy the unit and do it ourselves.
Through you, Chair, correct.
Any follow-up questions there, Councillor Stu? Nope. Okay. Councillor Dunstall was first, and then I'll get to you.
Thank you. Through you, Mayor. Looking at the numbers, it looks like there's about 42% of the 15.6 million is being spent on infrastructure and on road work. I've been told that we're on a 5-year cycle for reassessment for road work and that this is year 5, which is why we're incurring so much in costs. So I just wanted clarification. Is this something that happens every 5 years and then we get this big hit? Is this something that's going to be taken care of as we build our reserve so that in the 5-year span it's not going to be such a hit? Maybe you could clarify that for me.
Through you, Chair, the bulk of our road work that we're proposing in this year's budget largely is driven by what we would call a quality management system for, let's say, the water system. And that's a driver for a couple of the reconstructions that you see in front of you for 2023. There is also a component for growth that's driving a number of the projects as well. So you can see a number of the regional roads, Snyder's, Foundry. We have some road work for the Baden trunk sewer. Those are a few of the projects that are growth related and deal with our sanitary system that have to be addressed to accommodate things like growth as well as I&I reduction. To speak to the aspect of our roads need study, I believe that's what you're referring to in terms of our 5-year cycle. So we look at doing a comprehensive road need study that looks at road conditions and gives us an idea of what the current state of our road system is, as well as looking to more or less put a capital plan and an operational plan in place to address what our road needs are. Typically with roads, it's a very costly asset to reconstruct, but there are obviously scenarios where it's more beneficial to reconstruct the asset based on life cycle costs. In some cases, we would see increased maintenance needs and pothole repairs and that type of thing. Or we may see some localized failure of the road that needs to be addressed. And then when we look at that aligned with other infrastructure, other underground infrastructure needs, those are what we see as beneficial aligned projects. And so you can kind of see that in our list of projects that it looks like there's a bunch of road work. However, it's more comprehensive than just road work. There are underground services that are included in that as well. That being said, when we look at our surface treatment and our our hot mix asphalt programs, I'm going to say we're underfunding those particular assets when it comes to, and those programs when it comes to the projects that we undertake. And I'm certain that when we do have a roads need study come in, we are going to see that there should be more funding placed to support a road rehabilitation program, and specifically on just rehabilitation of that asset alone versus what's more or less included right now in the reconstruction schedule.
Any follow-up questions, Councillor Dunstall?
No, I'm good, thanks.
Okay, and now we have a list, so it's going to be Councillor Wilkinson, then Cressman, then Martin.
Thank you. Through you, Chair. I'm going to go back to the roadside mower and the sidewalk clearing unit. Not that we need to group them together by any means, but When comparing the two, looking at them, I mean, is there one unit versus the other that potentially is less of a cost to service that might still be able to squeak out another year? And as sort of a preemptive follow-up to that, is there one unit that you deem would be a more pressing need than the other if we were to potentially push one of these to next year?
Through you, Chair. For these two units, I'm going to say the mower is in worse condition, and we would see that as a higher priority to replace. There are options out there, but again, with looking at rentals of those types of units, I don't think that's the mower itself, having looked into a bit of it so far, doesn't look like it's a very good solution and a reliable solution for us. When we look at the sidewalk clearing unit, that is probably one that we could look to a different solution in terms of whether we lease something, a temporary lease, or defer something for a period of time. That's something we could look into and report back certainly through later meetings.
Follow-up question?
So not a follow-up question, I appreciate the insight. Through you, Mayor. What I'd like to do is, if we can add to that list, that sidewalk clearing unit, potentially have come back for discussion.
Okay, so in that case, just to make our lives easier, we're going to do an amendment for that now, so that that's added and we can see where that goes once we vote. Councillor Cressman, did you have a question on that before we vote on that?
Yes, just to follow up. Is there such a thing as lease to own? Where you would, you know what a lease to own is.
Through you, Chair, I don't have that answer for you at the moment. We can certainly look into that and report back.
So I guess before we do that amendment, voting on it, does anybody else have questions pertaining specifically to what Councillor Wilkinson has brought forward? No? Okay, so Councillor Wilkinson, can you just confirm what exactly the amendment is that you'd like made?
In essence, I'd like to actually potentially push this unit into next year's purchase, or have it come back for report and a further decision made at council. I'm not sure which would be more feasible, but I suppose I'd like to start by saying let's push this particular sidewalk clearing unit to next year's budget.
Okay, so you want to defer it before we get information back from staff? You want to push it off to next budget?
Yes.
Okay, so you've moved that. Do I have a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Sadhu. All of those in favor? Okay, and your hand is up there, Councillor Dunstall. Is that correct? Yes? Okay, and then all of those opposed? Councillor Murray. All right, so that has passed. Now we will get back to our general questions on infrastructure services, and we are now on to Councillor Cressman.
Yes, I thought I had these pages all laid out that I could identify it, but I think there was a recommendation to review bylaw 8472, I think, in the script, and I would see that as a something that we should be doing, and how do we get that initiated? So whatever is required to get it initiated, I would so move. Through you, Mayor, I'm sorry, I slapped my hand tonight.
Through you, Chair, I believe you're referencing the sidewalk clearing bylaw?
Yeah. Yes, it kind of follows to where our discussion was previously.
So through you, Chair, yeah, so there's a history to that report in terms of why it's sort of attached as it is. There was a request from the budget process last year to look at level of service for sidewalk clearing for winter control. The report at this point is more or less recommending that we look at that bylaw to modernize it. There were other elements that were, I guess, intended for the review in terms of, if we could increase levels of service in different areas. And at this point, staff are not recommending that we undertake that review. That may be something more beneficial to proper and full consultation, which at this point we don't really have the resources to undertake that. And quite frankly, I don't think we've heard that from the public. At this point, I would also say from a staff level, if we were to look at changing the service format in full, we're going to see a substantial shift in terms of costs and what administratively would be needed to manage the program. So at this point, what we're recommending is let's review the bylaw and modernize it. Again, that comes down to staffing resources and availability for us to do that. And I would say it's on the list. I wouldn't say it's the highest on the priority list, but it's certainly one that we would like to see modernized among a few other bylaws that we certainly need in infrastructure services.
Through you, Mayor, just as a follow-up, so I'm clear here, I don't want to create additional work if you don't see it necessarily. I just got the impression from reading through this that you were suggesting that it be done. So do we just say as time is available, or how do we leave that?
Through you, Chair, it's I think you would be okay to recognize that it's on the list to do, and we certainly will work through it when we have the availability to do that. You may also see some of that intertwining with some of the levels of service and those types of requests that may come through future staffing resource requests as well. So I think at this point, note that we know it's on the list and needs to be looked at, and we'll undertake it when resources permit.
Okay, and over to Councillor Martin, please.
Thank you. Through you, Chair Salonen. I believe this question is for you, Director Mullenhouse. I heard you say a few minutes ago that part of what determines the reconstruction, the road construction, is the underground infrastructure. And given that last week we didn't openly talk about it, but we were informed that as councillors we have some ownership in the water quality, so I think that's a good thing. Let's take care of the water. That sounds good to me. But I'm curious, how do you decide roads that don't have sidewalks? Is there some kind of plan in place for deciding when to put sidewalks in? Sometimes, and part of it was through the campaigning, I hear people saying one road or another road, there's no sidewalk on this road, what about safety? Is there a plan in place? And maybe there is and I haven't read it or somehow missed it, but how do you decide when and where to put in sidewalks?
Through you, Chair. Typically with active transportation and accessibility, we're going to look at, we'll focus on road reconstructions, I guess, for a moment. If it's a section of road that doesn't currently have a sidewalk on it, and there's we'll say a rural cross section or a semi-urban cross section, so that would be something without curb and gutter. It may just have ditches and stuff like that. So we would look to try to introduce sidewalk where we can, but we would also try to align that with things like, let's say, parks, for example, and Greenwood Drive might be a good example to speak to. That's a local road. It's a cul-de-sac, but there's a park on that particular street. The road cross-section doesn't currently have a sidewalk, and we are looking to introduce a sidewalk to connect the accessibility component to that park. So in situations like that, we would look to introduce, and you would typically see that through, communicated through a road reconstruction process. In other areas, we would rely on feedback from residents. So if there's, a section that somebody's brought forward to our operations group and through our points of contact, then we would note that, and if points of connectivity are needed, then we would look to introduce those in our capital budget. But I can say there's not a lot of those that do get brought forward, at least formally directly to us. There is also the aspect of the multi-use trails and the connectivity there. Then we have a few of those locations that have been brought forward in recent years that we've invested in as well. So we do look to incorporate those as they come up. With respect to, we'll say, single-sided or double-sided sidewalk, Hamilton Road is a good example. So on a collector road like that, we are looking to introduce sidewalk connectivity in specific locations because of the use of that section of road, and because it is a high volume traffic road. It typically should have that volume should have a two-sided sidewalk, and so we look to identify those locations for needs, and then we'll introduce them as we can. For most other local roads, there is a split philosophy, I guess, in terms of whether you do two-sided or one, and probably more recently, it's, we look at introducing, we'll say, a single-sided sidewalk, where it's not a higher volume road, and you can probably see that in some of the newer built areas in more recent times. So that's just a general overview of I guess, how we would look to introduce sidewalks.
Any follow-up questions, Councillor Martin?
If I could, through you, Chair Salomon, and I appreciate all of that information, Director Mullenhouse. That was good, and I didn't give you warning on that. I'm sorry. It was just something that I realized as we were talking that I hadn't asked about. So in terms of a process, if we wanted to bring forward a request, or if citizens, residents are interested in putting forward a request, what's the best way to do that regarding sidewalks?
Through you, Chair, our good points of contact for us are engineering at Wilmot.ca and public works at Wilmot.ca. And if we do receive communication on that, we'll log it and place it in our capital process for review. Typically with those types of requests, we'll include it in the budget process where we have the requests available and have time to look at cost estimates and stuff like that. I think if you look through past budget processes, probably in the last 3 or 4 years, we actually did that for Huron Road, and I think we're also looking at that in Mannheim for a section of road as well.
Thank you.
Any other questions on the capital initiatives for infrastructure services? Okay, seeing none, we will move. Oh, my apologies, Lillian. I'm sorry. Please go ahead, Councillor Dunstall.
That's okay. I figured my big face is pretty big there. It's hard to miss me. Through you, Mayor. Between the 3 trucks, the tandem, the single, and there's a flusher, it's almost $1 million. 2 questions. Has this already been purchased and we're waiting for delivery and to pay? And are these replacement vehicles for vehicles we currently have?
Through you, Chair, that's correct. These are vehicles that have already been approved. The tandem and the single were approved, I believe, at the last council meeting, and as noted, they'll take about 2 years, up to 2 years, to deliver. So we were looking for pre-approval because of the schedule and trying to get into the queue for that, for those 2 items. The single axle is new, and the tandem is a replacement unit. For the flusher truck, that was purchased, I believe, last summer. At some point last year, and that's also a 1 to 2 year time frame to deliver, and that is an existing unit that's being replaced.
Okay, further. So as we move forward, these purchases we're going to be building up that reserve so that when it comes time to buy these purchases, it's not going to be such a big hit. Is that correct?
Through your Chair Salonen, in theory, if Council continues to support transfers to our infrastructure reserve funds, yes, the goal would be to put sufficient funding within our own reserve funds to replace existing infrastructure and fleet. So the goal would hopefully be that there'd be funds in place to do that, 10 to 15 years down the road when they're ready to be replaced.
Thank you.
Okay, we'll ask Councillor Crespin.
So this is, through you, Mayor, this may be a question that would be more appropriate in the 10-year capital budget, but as well as we see cost inflation on some of these units, what type of contracts do we have to hold a supplier to what their quote was in terms of some of these vehicles? Is it buyer beware, or is it something that we have firm quotes when we order these 2 years out?
Through you, Chair, with RFPs, we have language in there that more or less, it's the price that's bid, and there's minimal escalation that would be associated with it. I'm not in full knowledgeable about the canoe process, but I believe there's a slight escalation component to it. However, there are, I think, elements of that process that reduce the risk in terms of the cost. So the way that we look at some of our larger units, there's a chassis that needs to be built, and so the timing of that, and knowing what market prices are around the timing of that, we'll say delivery, and then the other component of the bucket and the other components that come to finish off the truck unit, those are prices that are finalized at the time of completion. However, there are, I guess, risk reduction, we'll say clauses, but I don't know exactly how they're referenced. I would say my expectation is not a high risk or high movement cost increase, and so having gone through the procurement process with Canoe only a few times, we are still waiting to see, but we are also looking at what language there is in there to control that, and I think that there's a strong understanding that it is controlled.
Any final questions on infrastructure services initiatives? Okay, seeing none, we will move along to community services. Do we have any questions of any of these projects, councillors? Councillor Wilkinson?
Yeah, through you, Mayor. There's one thing I don't see listed on our little booklet here, but I do know is included in the report, and that's talking about the parking lot expansion for this facility that we're in right now. There's a $202,000 general levy funded debenture there. I'm curious, and potentially this is a question for Director of Corporate Services Kelly, are we able to recover cost savings by not moving forward with that project, given that we've already purchased the new Alpine building and will be, in essence, saving space here and not maybe require a larger parking lot? But ultimately, is like, if we were to pull back that debt funding, what kind of savings would we be looking at?
Through the chair, I'll start with the first part of your question, Councillor. With respect to the expansion of the parking lot, we would have to take a look once the people plan is brought forward to see what the future looks like for the township as far as additional staff. There will be some parking freed up from eventually from the fire department shifting out, so you're absolutely correct. There's also some redesign synergies that can be done with respect to how the parking lot is laid out. The spaces that we currently have are quite wide and could they're definitely wider than the typical standard, so we could add a few spaces that way. As a result, there is certainly the potential to think about resurfacing this particular existing parking lot and laneway, and adding the lighting and not doing the expansion immediately and doing the expansion down the road. Director Kelly would have to comment on how that impacts the financing piece, but we do have a pretty rough parking lot and laneway. The substrate does need to be replaced. It's why we're getting additional potholes. It's starting to sink in some areas. So, and we don't meet current code for the lighting in that parking lot with what we have out there. So those would be my comments with respect to what we can do with this project, and then I'll pass it over to Director Kelly regarding the finances.
Sure, thank you. Through you, Chair Salonen. So, as you noted, the project is partially funded through development charges and partially funded through levy-funded debenture. If we did move forward on debenture on the levy side, we're looking at about between $15,000 and $16,000 in new annual debt servicing costs that you would be avoiding in 2024 and moving forward. Also, with about $250,000 of the project being DC funded, and we know the status of our DCs, that would just reduce the amount of debt we'd need to issue from development charges, which the report notes we're looking at a cash flow analysis of what's affordable from a debt financing there.
Great. Any follow-up questions, Councillor?
Through you, Mayor, that would be a project I would like to defer and seek further information on before we choose to move forward with it.
So are you putting that forward as an amendment right now? Okay.
Yes.
And do we have a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Sadhu. All those in favor? Okay. And all those opposed? And Councillor Dunstall, I'm just trying to figure out what you.
I'm sorry, I didn't hear what was on the floor to vote on. I apologize.
Oh, that's okay. Councillor Wilkinson, did you just want to quickly reiterate?
Yeah, through you, Mayor, Councillor Dunstall, just looking at the parking lot expansion and resurfacing for this facility, deferring that for more information.
Totally agree. Yes.
Okay, great. So that passes unanimously. Are there any other additional questions for the capital initiatives for community services? Councillor Cressman.
Yes, I was looking at $535,000 estimate for the new access to the wetlands, the Mike Scout wetlands, and the guardrail features from the girder bridge from Bridge Street. And I would like to separate what is the cost of the girder bridge component versus
through you, Chair. Sorry, we're just looking at who should answer the question. Yeah, so there's, as far as, maybe just back it up a bit, as far as the relocation of the structure, we did have a council resolution that spoke to a time frame, so December 31st of last year. We've been looking at a very, I would say, minor cost to deconstructing the bridge, and doing that obviously with a plan to retain some of the pieces and look to moving those to the wetland. At this point, we have a cost for that decommissioning of the bridge itself, which is in the $15,000 to $30,000 range, not substantial as far as the overall cost to that project, the bridge project. There are other components that we haven't sorted out yet, and I don't think we have a detailed answer for that piece of it at this point. There are a couple different plans that we've talked about, but I think some of it is also contingent on funding as well, that we were looking for external sources of funding before we were to proceed with any plans. So I would say there's a couple different options we're looking at, and I don't know entirely at this point if it's of value to speak to those numbers at this point until we know a bit more about potential for funding. Again, we could look to a very minimized cost right now to decommission the structure, and then we're evaluating what options we have to move it to the wetlands. And if it's not feasible, if it is cost prohibitive, then you very likely will see a recommendation from staff to move to the next stage of looking at alternatives to fully decommission the structure and have an acknowledgement of that piece. But again, I think that has to be reported back to council when we do have that detail handy.
And through the chair, I can add to that with respect to the entrance. The initial estimate that we have is about $350,000 to design and construct the laneway, the walkway, and all of the work leading up to the parking lot that Mr. Scout already constructed and paved. So it's about $350,000 for that aspect, and then we added in additional money for the Bridge Street Bridge relocation piece on top of that. And just a reminder, there is a grant application out there. We just have not heard back yet with respect to the results of that application. Thank you.
Any, Councillor Stu?
Through you, the Mayor, just to that, any idea how much the grant would be if it was to come through?
Through the Mayor, through the Chair, we did apply for the full amount, I believe $535,000 or $550 in that range. And it would cover both aspects of the project.
Councillor Cressman.
Just so I had earmarked this as something that nice to have, but if we have other areas that we need our money, then so given that, is there any way that we said if we get the grant that we would move forward with this, or is that a weak-kneed approach to undermine our grant application?
Through the Mayor, I think that's always an option that Council can say that this is dependent upon funding through grant applications. We'll always continue to seek other opportunities as well to try and find funding. The risk is outlined in the justification sheet that if we don't do any improvements to the laneway, I specifically stayed in here, but we wouldn't be able to open the lane that's there. It wouldn't be safe to do so. So parking for access to the wetlands would continue to be on Smith Creek Drive in order to access it. So that would be my only, not necessarily caution, but reminder that is quite a narrow street and could quite create some bottlenecking. But we don't feel it's safe to open a single lane with foot pedestrians, bikes, children, and cars coming in two directions. So that would be my comment.
Just to add on to that, as far as the options, we have done that in previous capital programs. We've had capital initiatives that were subject to if we did receive grant funding. One recent one was one to do with the backflow preventers in New Hamburg. We applied for a program that would have been $240,000. We didn't receive the funding, so we canceled that initiative until funding was made available. If we had that direction, I would just update the capital forecast to say we're not assuming that's going to be debt financed. We're assuming it's going to be funded through grant funding, and if the grant funding doesn't come in, then we'd have to revisit it down the road.
With that, do you want to do anything, Councillor Cressman?
Well, yes, safety is important, and we have a feature that is, that is going to be used, I believe. But I also run 2 half-mile lanes made of gravel, and I'm kind of looking at this and saying, I put gravel driveways and different things in, and certainly not in this order of magnitude. So I don't know how. My view on Google Maps showed that the area, I haven't visited personally, so it could be an area that it's the depth of one housing lot to get into that area. And so the ability to scoop out topsoil and put pit run and gravel or whatever over the top, I think, to widen it up and create a safe entrance. That's all I was looking at as being an alternative.
Oh, sorry.
Thank you, Chair. That's an excellent point. We certainly can look at a different surface other than paving it. There is some retaining wall requirements because of as you indicated, it is a house lot, I believe, that the entrance is located in. And we have included in that pricing retaining wall costs in order to ensure. So there's a little bit more excavating is what I'm suggesting, but definitely looking at a granular base would be a lower cost option.
Councillor Cressman, did you have a follow-up before or no? It's okay if not.
Well, I guess I'm struggling to know what the proper approach is. I think certainly a granular base is what I would recommend, but in terms of the grant, I would say if we can receive the grant, then I would go the whole, in the vernacular, the whole 9 yards. But I think that would be my motion, is that at minimum we would have a granular base and address improvement of the entrance to widen it for safety purposes, and then subsequent apply for the grant and if successful, do the improvements as suggested.
So you've moved that as a
I
motion on the floor?
I would
Okay.
move that.
Seconded by Councillor Wilkinson. Any questions on that before we move forward with the vote? Yes, Councillor Martin.
Thank you, through you, Chair Salonen. Because the topic has been brought up, Director Jackson, I'm curious, was there any consideration of a substance other than pavement when the decision was made to put in, or to put in that request for pavement? Because my understanding with the wetlands is that it might actually mitigate some flooding. And when I listen to or read up about mitigation of flooding, usually the recommendation is not to use asphalt, but to use other substances in order to let the water flow away. Now, maybe there's not any flooding in the driveway or any potential for flooding there, but I'm just kind of curious. And again, this question was not, it just came out of this discussion, so I'm sorry for not giving warning on this question.
Through the chair, certainly not an expert on wetlands and how the water might impact and what surfaces are best to use, so I put that disclaimer out there initially. I think in this circumstance and the location of the laneway that a granular substance would work. Mr. Scout talked about a granular surface for the parking lot and ended up going with a permanent solution to reduce. His whole goal with this project is to reduce maintenance for the township and to ensure that we don't have a lot of capital costs. So that was, I believe, behind, without trying to speak on his behalf, I believe that was behind part of his decision. So I think it is certainly an option to look at granular. I don't know how much it would save us, and I don't know whether I can put Mr. Mollenhouse on the spot, whether he might know. No, okay, thank you. And, the other piece I would just want to point out is that within that entrance area, we are looking for a pedestrian footpath that's separate from the laneways as well. So that, I just want to clarify with Councillor Cressman, that would be one of the inclusions in that. Yes, thank you. Did that answer your question?
Thank you, through you, Chair Salonen. Thank you, Director Jackson. And in reference to Councillor Cressman's comment about usage, I stopped by the other day. Curiosity got the better of me just to see, and I wish I could honestly say I looked from the other side of the fence, but I actually did go over the fence, so I guess I could get charged by a bylaw officer. But I actually noticed a number of people already using it, and I know that there were people cross-country skiing there. Like, I think the usage is going to be great. I see a lot of people interested. It's a wonderful facility.
If I could, Chair, we did see significant usage when the construction first completed. I think this is going to be a destination location for sure.
Through you, Chair, just for clarity then, is the motion to only consider the project as presented if we are successful in receiving the funding, and that Director Jackson report back on a proposed interim solution for the entrance with some costs? Would that be appropriate?
Yes, that would, you can say it much better than I can.
Okay, any other questions of council before we vote on that? Okay, and in that case, all of those in favor? And that passes unanimously. Any other questions regarding community services initiatives?
I'm sorry, I did have a follow-up to that, through you, Mayor. What is the debt servicing charge that we've just potentially saved?
Just going to give Director Kelly a moment.
Thanks, Director Kelly.
Well, he's doing that. Councillor Dunstall, did you have a question that could be answered?
I did. Thank you. Through you, Mayor. Ms. Jackson, the $700,000 that we're looking at in additional funds for the Nith River seems kind of high. What was the original budget, and why is there such a huge amount coming around for the second time? And one more question. Is it available? Are there any grants available for that project?
Through the chair, that was a few questions. Let me try to grasp those. I'm going to answer your last question first. There are currently 2 grants that we already have successfully attained for that project. 165 for one, the red grant, and Mr. Kelly, I'm looking at you.
We received $48,000 through the Rural Economic Development Fund and $200,000 through the Kennedy Community Revitalization Fund.
Thank you. And with respect to the original budget, I would have to look back at previous capital lists, but the design was not completed at the time of that. When the original budget was put in, we really didn't know what we were constructing and what the community wanted. We went out for public consultation and got feedback on some design concepts, and the updated design was then put to the test as far as the cost, and that was the cost that came in. And we did tender this project last fall, and we received 0 bids on the project. So we did reach out, and I believe at that time we had a total of 700, Amber, is that right? 700,000. We went back to a few of the contractors who picked up the RFP but did not bid, and we asked them if they could price the project for us so that we could retender it in the future, and that was where the full cost came back, and we required the additional 700. So that was based on estimates from the contractors that showed some interest but did not bid on the project in the fall.
Okay, follow up, please, through you, Mayor. Ms. Jackson, that 165, is that the 165 plus 48 plus 200, which comes up to $413,000? And did you say that those grants are in place? So would that be taken off the 700,000 that we have there, or is that in addition to?
Through the chair, that is in addition. That's already accounting for the grants.
So it's about 400 in grants and then another 700 in addition to that.
That's correct.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. We're going to go back to Director Kelly, and then we'll get to you.
Sorry, and thank you for asking the question, Councillor Dunstall, to buy me some time to answer Councillor Wilkinson's question. So if the Mike Scout Wetlands Entrance and Bridge Relocation Project was only moving forward in the event we got grant funding, it would remove the $535,000 debt requirement. That would result in approximately $40,000 of annual servicing costs being removed. To be clear, with that project and the admin complex, those are debt servicing costs that would begin in 2024 that you're removing, so it doesn't impact the current year levy on those ones, but it does impact the requirement next year.
Okay, and Councillor Cressman.
Yes, since many of us weren't around the council horseshoe when that original project was approved, could you give a high-level description of it, what the promenade entails, just to assist us in determining value for dollars?
Through the chair, yes, absolutely, and I might even lean on my neighbor here who has been, Mr. Martin, who has been very involved in this project, as well as our project coordinator, Amber, who's with us this evening as well. So this project includes replacing the existing paved paths that are along the water's edge, some improvements to the riprap, which is supporting the embankment in that area to make it safer, looking at lighting replacement in that area, and extending the path up to the Cenotaph location, up in that direction, replacing some of the trees that have passed away over the years, and improving the shade, looking at a sort of a I don't want to call it a performance center, but like a landing area where you could do announcements, you could do musical events, that sort of thing. It's just a flat area in that space. And what am I missing, Mr. Martin? Anything? Is that about it?
Yeah, just a couple more comments. I guess the main goal was to rehabilitate the current erosion along the bank and to make the project accessible. So we initially did have a broader scope of the project and narrowed it down once we saw some of the costs. So originally it was going to provide an upper and lower pathway. The project was scoped back to make one seamless connection that was fully accessible, and then just to cleaning up the existing viewing area that comes off the Huron Street parking lot. But kind of the primary goals were scoped back to the idea of making it fully accessible in terms of the slopes, lighting, and then to deal with the erosion components to clean up the riprap along the slope.
Thank you. Any follow-up question there, Councillor Cressman? No?
Well, I guess the question is, from erosion perspective, the Nith is the Nith, and it has a history of, at times, not wanting to stay inside its banks. Are we confident that the money spent will address that? Like, is it, I forget what they call that in the wire baskets, Gambian, I think, something or other. Gambian, well, come see, come saw, anyway. But anyhow, it has that type of construction to ensure that it is protected in flood events into the future.
Yeah, through you, Chair Solomon. Yeah, the Gabion component is closer to the bridge, and that part isn't changed. The issue that's been problematic in the past has been closer to the dam itself. So, I mean, there's been some improvements done to that area with concrete because the water has caused issues with asphalt in the past. And then their component is the existing riprap is basically round stones that are placed there, but the amount of vegetation that grows up and the ongoing maintenance requirements of that. So there's an unsightly component, but there's also just the ability for that to move, to be picked up with floodwaters. So the idea is to actually take larger armor stones and have them on their side. So it would be a flat surface. So in theory, the water and ice would slide more easily across it. So it provides the same stability, but should provide, and certainly the consultant indicated would provide less long-term maintenance requirements.
Councillor Martin.
Through you, Chair Salonen, in reference to those comments, I express appreciation. I appreciate the work that you've been doing on this. Since I do run through that area a couple times a week and I regularly walk by it almost every day, I think it's it is a great feature of New Hamburg, and I'd like to say our township, although maybe other people in other parts of the township would express appreciation elsewhere. But yeah, with the flooding, anything we can do to somehow hopefully still have a nice area even after a flood, I think is good. So I appreciate this.
Councillor Dunstall.
Thank you, through you, Mayor. You know, we are posed pretty nicely, certainly in Wilmot, but in New Hamburg with the water wheel and the Scout wetlands. And so for economic development, I think it would be great to have the promenade as well. Certainly bringing in tourist dollars from the outside in always helps grow our businesses and grow our tax base. So my question to you is, you've got the amount at 700. We've got $413 in grants. Can we not go in with a lower price? I mean, I understand you've set the price at 7, but can we not go in setting a price at 5 plus the 413? That brings it to over $900,000. You don't think we could do it for that amount?
Through the chair, we can certainly look at the scope of work when the RFP goes out, and we could get some line item pricing on some of the components. We did go out specifically, as I mentioned, to 2 of the construction companies that were interested in this project, and they both came in at over $1 million in their estimates when they provided us the pricing. So we would have to look at eliminating some components in order to take it down by the 200,000, I would believe.
Okay, great, thank you. And my experience has been that when people quote, sometimes they quote a little high, so maybe we could go in a little bit lower with those guys, but thank you for your response.
And I'd also just want to add comments, keeping in mind that these grants are from our upper governments. There is actually often a responsibility that we have to pay a portion of it as well, so we have our end of the bargain to hold up certainly on this, and we wouldn't want to look ungrateful and not follow through with a project by any means, just as a general commentary on that. Any other questions for community service initiatives? No? Oh, sorry, Councillor Cressman.
Yes, this goes to what I would call the old New Hamburg Arena, whatever we're calling it, whatever its moniker is, through you, Mayor. I guess the question is, I think there was an announcement last fall from our local MPP about approximately $5 million, and I'm wondering where I see that embedded. Does it come through our books? Is it embedded in some of the projects? And just so I didn't see it highlighted in any shape or form.
Through you, Mayor Salonen, it is within the 10-year capital forecast. We have it set to commence in 2024. It'd be approximately a 3-year initiative with the $5.7 million spread over 3 years. You will be receiving a report to council at our next open council meeting, I believe February 27th or March 6th. With that specific grant funding, speaking of a transfer payment agreement from the Strategic Priorities Infrastructure Fund, but the project's on the books to begin in 2024 and last for approximately 3 years.
And Council, just to go back, Councillor Dunstall, Director Jackson was wondering, are you looking to put forward a motion to give staff direction that we come in at a lower price, like at the 500,000, or were you just giving that for general?
No, I would like to do that. If I can do that, I would like to take that opportunity to do that.
Sure. So if you can just clarify, is it you want it to come in the RFP to go out at 500,000?
Well, I'm not sure how your RFP works. I'm not sure if for your RFP you have the grant money as well as the 500, so you'd go in at whatever that is, 914,000, or if the grant money is handled separately. So my ask would be that the amount maximum to be paid outside of the grants would be 500. So I'm not sure how that's presented in the RFP.
Okay, I will turn it over to CAO Chambers before I misspeak more.
May I make a suggestion?
Yes.
That we direct Director Jackson to report back at the next budget meeting after reviewing the scope of the work for the Promenade project to see if there's an opportunity to reduce the scope of work and reduce project costs.
Are you comfortable with that being the motion, Councillor Dunstall?
What she said is perfect.
Okay, and Councillor Cressman, is that a question or to second it? Okay, seconded by Councillor Cressman. All those before that, any questions, councillors? Okay, so we will now call that to a vote. All those in favor? And that passes unanimously. Okay, any final questions on community service initiatives? Councillor Dunstall.
I'm sorry, and I promise this is the last one, Sandy, I promise you. I know that we had discussed the last meeting about looking at alternatives for ice time as the ice pad has been pushed down for a few years. And I just didn't know if there was something we needed to do at this meeting to continue that going, or if the direction that we'd given at the last meeting has our township staff looking into that. I just wanted an update on that if that's possible.
Through the chair, CAO Chambers may want to comment, but we have been discussing with the Township of Wellesley. However, their CAO is away on vacation, so I don't know if CAO Chambers has any further update.
Yes, through you, Chair. I believe the direction from Council was for us to report back, and so we are still fact-finding, as Director Jackson said. I will follow up with the CAO of Wellesley, and we will provide a formal report back to Council at the next budget meeting.
Great, thank you.
Councillor Cressman.
This is going back through you, Mayor, a question in terms of the information that was sent out on the capital budget for this current year by Director Kelly, and it talked about I think on page 6 of 7, it talks about near the bottom. There's a paragraph that talks about debt from staff's perspective should be limited to growth-related and user paid. And I certainly concur with that. And then I thought I saw something in the 10-year capital plans where you drilled down on some of the costs from community services, like roof replacement at community centers, etc., that were debenture funded. And so I found that at odds with what I thought was a principle that I strongly would suggest we follow here in your summary. So did I misread that, or?
No, through you, Chair Sallin, you read it correctly. So as you're aware, and we've mentioned a few times, the township doesn't have a specific debt management policy established at this point in time. We're working on that debt management strategy and hoping to bring it forward following this budget. The rationale why some projects this year that are levy-funded projects are proposed to be debt financed is because we do not have sufficient funds within our existing reserve funds, and we do not have a sufficient capital levy dollar amount to fund those projects for them to move forward without it being debt financed. If our capital levy allocation isn't at 1.4 million sometime down the road, it's at 1.72 million, it helps for our internal capacity to fund levy funded initiatives with current dollars rather than relying on debt financing. But to move forward with some of those levy funded projects right now, as is laid out in the program, they would need to be debt financed.
Through you, Mayor, just a follow-up question. So I'm trying to get the lay of the land as it comes to debentures. The ones have been issued in the past are 20-year term, 10-year. The interest is recalculated at 10 years. Do we have any other forms of financing? And I think you mentioned it in some of your opening comments. Is there such a thing as a shorter-term debenture, et cetera, that we could investigate till we have this promise of development charges arrive at a doorstep?
Yes, through you, Chair Armstrong, there are opportunities to shorten the term on our debentures. That's obviously going to increase the annual servicing costs, which with the status of our development charges right now would make it even more difficult from a cash flow perspective. Having said that, if we look at levy-funded projects, if their lifespan is shorter term, we would obviously look for a shorter term debenture of around 10 years. But that whole process is undertaken during the spring and fall debt issuance, and those debt issuances are brought forward to council to make you aware of what the format of the debt is, the term, and the percentage yield on it.
Councillor Cressman.
Yes, through you, Mayor, and again, I'll chalk this as up through my inexperience, and so I'll ask it again. I think as well you mentioned this idea of an outside consultant doing cash flow analysis, and we don't want to be in a situation where we've taken on too much debt or we've misread when the development charges are going to arrive, that we're in a cash flow crunch. And having been through that in my farming career, I realize it creates angst, and especially if you try to grow too fast, as my accountant slapped my hands in the past. So all to say, what comes first here in terms of how we move forward? You know, how do we make sure we're not out over the handlebars too far when it comes to debt, and that we have the debt servicing ability? Because it almost seems we've got to approve our budget, approve our debt, and then find out whether we're in a situation that we have the cash flow to pay it. So just help me out on that rationale.
Yeah, it's a great question. Through you, Chair Sallin, and to Councillor Cressman. Historically, we haven't been in this situation because we did have sufficient discretionary reserve funds and other reserve funds in place that we could finance a lot of our, what I'll call DC debt internally. We didn't have to seek external resources, so we weren't put in this position. We did put language within the report that I tried to make it clear. We would want the results of that cash flow analysis to come back before we issued any DC funded debt. We wouldn't proceed with that debt issuance prior to knowing that we have sufficient cash flows in place and future DC collections are lining up to to fund the debt servicing costs on that. We would see that cash flow analysis probably coming back for an information style report to council so that you know and can feel comfortable that staff can move forward with those initiatives without putting us in a difficult financial situation.
Thank you very much. That puts my mind at ease.
Okay, final questions on community service initiatives. Seeing none, we're going to move on to the final department, which is development services, and they only have one project. Does anybody have any questions on this? Okay, seeing none, I will now call a vote just to quickly remind everybody of the motion. Sorry, I'm just... So we are going to have our Deputy Clerk, Chad Curtis, upload all of our motion amendment changes so that we can see in full what we are actually voting on now. And thank you for taking those in real-time updates for us. Is it possible to make it a bit bigger?
Through the chair, just give me a second here.
Or if you could even read them out, I just can't read that from here.
Okay. I will read them out.
Okay, thank you.
The first one is that the sidewalk clearing unit be deferred to the 2024 municipal budget. The second is that the parking lot expansion, LED lighting and laneway resurfacing be deferred to receive additional information. The third is that the Mike Shout Wetlands entrance and bridge relocation be dependent on successful grant funding, and that staff be directed to investigate an interim solution to the entrance to the wetlands. And the fourth is that staff be directed to review the scope of work and report back to council on options for reducing overall costs related to the Nith River Promenade project.
And then beyond all of that, the original recommendation is that the report outlining the draft of the 2023 capital program be received for information purposes. Does anybody have any questions, clarifications?
I just want, sorry, it's through you, Mayor.
Yep.
Does that include the PMP piece, the SMART that we spoke about originally, or is that something totally different? Or do we have to note that?
Through you, Chair, I believe there was a separate motion that directed me to bring back a report, so I think that's sufficient.
Thank you.
May I clarify at this point, you're not asking for anything related to the capital project, a deferral or anything like that? You would like to have the report back first, is that correct?
Yes, I would like to have the report back before we make decisions.
Okay.
Okay. With all of that clarified, we will now call to the vote. All those in favor? And that passes unanimously. We will now move along to report 11.2, which is the 10-year capital forecast update. We're first going to get it on the floor, and the recommendation is that report COR 2023-17 regarding the Township's updated 10-year capital forecast be received for information purposes. To get it on the floor, may I have a mover? Moved by Councillor Cressman, seconded by Councillor Wilkinson, and I will now turn it back over to Director Kelly to introduce the report.
First of all, to Deputy Clerk Chad Curtis, yes, we'll make an effort to get Microsoft Word installed on your computer over there.
It's very much appreciated.
This report outlines our 10-year capital forecast. As noted in my opening presentation, Council is responsible during the budget year for approving the current year capital program and then endorsing in principle the forecast for the next 9 years. The 10-year forecast is a living document that is fluid, having changes annually and revisions based on new senior government funding opportunities, updated results from need studies, resource availability, legislative requirements, and as witnessed this year more than any other year, inflationary adjustments. Staff continually incorporate data derived from numerous studies to build the 10-year capital forecast and evolve it each year. The report touches on a number of those master planning exercises that have taken place to form the basis for this year's program. A key component of our 10-year forecast is development charges funding, which you'll see from the top level sheet. Development charges are expected to fund over $55 million of our 10-year capital program. I don't need to speak at length anymore about the criticality of growth within Wilmot Township to fund our capital program, but you can witness it on page 1 of the 10-year forecast. Another critical component for funding are senior government funding allocations. They are the top section on your summary page. We have spoken, this council, at Roma and lobbied to government, senior government individuals at the political level and the staff level on the criticality of stable, reliable, and predictable funding. In the absence of that, our program becomes very difficult to project moving forward. Levy-funded debt financing is the orange bar at the bottom. So currently, the capital program in its current status over the next 10 years would require approximately $26.5 million of levy-funded debentures in the absence of new grant funding initiatives or other injections into the capital program. There is a graphic on page 6, which I did also put up in the original presentation, that shows the different funding sources that we rely on to make that program happen. You can see that the front end of the capital program right now is very heavy with expenditures that are pretty much tied to the growth that's coming in Wilmot Township. But the key is building up our own source revenues or own source resources to make it a sustainable program going forward. I also included a graphic of what we project to be our status of our infrastructure reserve funds if council continues the process of transferring tax dollars from each year into infrastructure reserve funds, which would reach a balance, I believe to Councillor Dunstall's question earlier, where we can start to fund our own replacements of infrastructure, our own replacements of fleet with funds that we have quote unquote in our bank account rather than taking on debt. With that, staff here have put a significant amount of work into updating our 10-year capital forecast. I know it's a lot of data and information to consume as a new council, but we're here to seek direction from you on your thoughts on the forecast and any feedback you have. So with that, I'll hand it back to Chair Salonen.
So councillors, I will open it up for questions if anybody has technical questions to ask. Councillor Cressman.
So this goes back to what we've experienced this, through you, Mayor, sorry, I apologize, through you, Mayor. What we've experienced this past year is certainly an unprecedented inflation. Hopefully it's in our rearview mirror soon. But the question is the 10-year, once you put something into the 10-year capital plan, does it get updated annually, or does it, is it 10 years out of date when you might, the maximum would be 10 years out of date when you come to exercise on the replacement of an asset?
Sure. Thank you for the question. Councillor Cressman, through you, Mayor Salonen, we do update the capital forecast annually based on current dollars. So that is a specific reason for that is the funding projections that we have as well are based on current dollars, not inflationary impacts, but each year we go through and we'll update those numbers. Sometimes the impact is very small and we don't need to change the projection that's out 8 years from now, but if it's significant enough, you'll see them highlighted as updated pricing within the forecast.
Any additional questions, councillors? Okay, seeing none, we will now call the vote on the recommendation. Oh, sorry, Councillor Cressman.
Sorry, I did have some a question to the Morningside trunk sewer, and trying to understand the history of that as it, through you, Mayor, sorry, I apologize, about the Morningside trunk sewer, and I understand because a good chunk of it so to speak, is DC funded. I would assume that was related to growth, but a portion, because we have to cross 7 and 8, is obviously picking up the wastewater from Morningside, or a portion thereof, or whatever. I'd like a little history of that, because is that a new initiative? Have we been picking up some of the wastewater in the past? Is this, you know, I guess I'm looking for a background on that, because we're going to be faced with how do we fund it at some point in time.
Through you, Chair. The Morningside trunk sewer history, as I know it, it was a regional asset that was transferred to us in the late 90s. We recently were looking at an EA to upgrade the trunk sewer. It does service quite a stretch of a portion of New Hamburg, as well as eventually to the Baden system. We were looking at that EA to upgrade that trunk sewer stretch. More or less what it exists today is it's on the north side of the 7-8 highway, and then it proceeds all the way through the Morningside community and then south and connects to the Morningside pumping station. And then the pumping station takes sewage flows to the New Hamburg treatment plant. When we initiated the EA, I want to say it was in 2018, we looked at some historic development infrastructure reports and master plans that sort of spoke to some of the key pieces of infrastructure that needed to be upgraded to facilitate development areas. We've had a number of changes in our we'll say servicing strategy since that time and previous to that time, due to some official plan changes and consolidation of development lands, and then certainly now looking at some of those components of changes to development areas and sort of centered on a node, we'll say, of Baden and New Hamburg. When we initiated that EA in 2018, we got into the first few months of the project, and then the region initiated a master plan for their servicing aspects for Baden and New Hamburg for water and wastewater. At that time, we chose to pause our EA so that we could look at what they were doing, the region, and sort of be integrated into that process. So what you're seeing here in the budget in terms of the dollar figure, what we had looked at previously was replacing and upsizing that Morningside trunk sewer. However, there's a number of elements at play that could change that based on what the region is planning for their infrastructure as well. So we're trying to coordinate those two items and for the sanitary network. And so what you see here is sort of a deferral of that capital cost that we're not sure exactly how that's going to come to fruition at this point. However, we have planted it within the budget based on what our previous plans were to upgrade that stretch of sewer south of the highway. We separated the two items because we know for sure that the section that crosses the highway needs an upgrade, but the section south may not necessarily need a full upgrade depending on what happens with the regional force main and the pumping station in Baden.
So just when through you, Mayor, just when I thought I had it figured out that all development in the township was the responsibility of the township, suddenly I find out the region has got a finger in it as well. And is this, what was their mandate prior to it? Why, what was, again, I'm not looking for it all, but broad strokes of what this, where did they actually insert themselves, and has their mandate been changed?
Through you, Chair. Historically, I think there was a number of service reviews that took place and looked at rationalization of particular assets in terms of when they became sort of a township asset and when they remained in a region asset. I can't speak to the full history of it. I don't know, but like I mentioned, it was probably about the late 90s that transfer took place. I believe it was actually at the time it was constructed as well, so there was a component there that I'm not sure how relevant the history really is. Looking at the system, we do have a couple sections, like the pumping stations noted in Baden, and then the Morningside pumping station, that are integrated within our system, in our local system, but they're regional assets. So it is a bit of a, we'll say, a coordinated effort at times, and it can be complicating in terms of project coordination, but we do endeavor to do what's best for the overall system. And that certainly is the township staff's goal, is looking at the overall system and what's best for the sanitary network and to facilitate growth in our area.
Through you, Mayor, one follow-up to that. That is to the crossing of 7 and 8 to the south there where Morningside is. I call that south, whether I have my directions right on that or not. But that we're not anticipating further growth in that direction. It's just to ensure the existing Morningside is properly served in terms of wastewater.
Through you, Chair, the name Morningside Trunk is just in reference to where it is. It meanders through that settlement area, if you will. The reference, as mentioned there, is just particularly to where it is. The land that it will service is north of the Highway 78. It's north of the tracks eventually as well. And as I mentioned, at this point, there is the connection to the Baden system. So those two components come into north of 7-8, and then eventually we'll get into that system and south to the pumping station. I'm not sure if that clears it up or if it's more confusing, but it is a trunk sewer that's referenced as Morningside only because it's existing right now through the Morningside community, and so it's an easy reference for us to know where it is.
Thank you. Any further questions, councillors? Okay, seeing none, we will now call to the vote. All those in favor? And that passes unanimously. So prior to our next report, I'm going to call back on CAO Chambers to provide an update on our next steps for the budget process.
Thank you, Chair. During our discussion this evening, Council provided direction to staff to defer a $150,000 levy-funded project, and this will translate to approximately 1.6% reduction to the projected levy adjustment for 2023, and that's going to reduce the previous operating levy estimate that we considered on February 13th from 8.89% down to 7.29%. With the dedicated infrastructure levy of 2.8%, that has the overall levy increase at this point at 10.09%, excluding any increases in service levels. The other directions to staff tonight will limit the debenture requirement in 2023 and future levy-funded debt servicing costs in 2024. So we've made some progress this evening, but we still have some work to do before we can approve the budget. We met today as staff, and we're proposing that the next budget meeting be scheduled for March 14th, if that is suitable to Council. I know at the last meeting you directed me to bring back a report on new staffing positions previously added in recent years, and at that point I would suggest that we discuss any proposed levels of service for 2023 as well. And I think you've given us some other items to report back on from this evening, so we will attempt to get that back to you for that evening as well. Now that you've seen the entire budget, we'd like to discuss the proposed target levy increase at that meeting if Council is prepared to give staff some direction. You know, we did say that we may have to employ some of our historical practices in balancing the budget for this year. And, you know, we've talked a lot about deferring projects, cutting costs and programs, but those also have operational risks or impacts to service levels. So I think it's really good for those conversations to happen in public, and that Council is making those decisions in an informed manner in public so that you're accepting the risk with those decisions. So I think we're committed to really put our nose to the grindstone, and if we need to have multiple meetings during that week to get it done, we're prepared as staff to free up the 15th and 16th as well, if that is suitable to council. And we can do a poll to council to ensure your availability for those evenings. And then we'd still like to have the goal of finalizing the budget and bringing it to council for final approval on Monday, March 20th, if that is suitable. So that's what I'm proposing, and would be happy to take any feedback on that at this point.
Councillor Martin.
Through you, Chair Salonen. Thank you, CAO Chambers. I'm curious, when you mentioned March 14th, we had an email today about March 15th. Did you mean to reference March 15th, or would be the 14th be first and then the 15th for sure, or I'm just trying to understand?
Through you, Chair, we did originally think the 15th, but when we sort of looked at where we are at with the budget, and we know that we have some work to do, we wanted to suggest to council that if you wanted additional meetings to really get this done, we're certainly open to that as staff.
Any additional questions or comments, councillors? Councillor Cressman?
I hope you take this in the right way, through you, Mayor. Beware the Ides of March.
Thank you very much, Councillor Cressman. I just wanted to say thank you again very much, staff. I think that these are really great conversations, and thank you, council, for the great questions. I also just want to reiterate to those watching, and perhaps that read some newspaper articles after our last meeting, we have not decided on our levy budget increase. So again, these are just informational to reiterate what CAO Chambers said. So be sure to tune in later at our additional meetings as to where we are going to be going with the tax levy. And again, if you have any more comments that you want to give myself or my fellow councillors, please do feel free to reach out. With that aside, we will now move on to 11.3, which the recommendation is that the report COR 2023-18 regarding the Rural Economic Development Fund be received for information, and further, that staff be directed to submit an application on behalf of the Township of Wilmot for funding towards the replacement of the pedestrian boardwalk under the Highway 78 bridge. To get this on the floor, may I have a mover? Moved by Councillor Martin, seconded by Councillor Dunstall, and I will now turn it over to Director Kelly to introduce the report.
Thank you, Chair Salonen. This application-based program opened for intake just on January 23rd and closes on February the 23rd, so a very short window, as you will come to know from funding programs from our senior levels of government. However, this funding assistance could be very valuable to the township to helping offset the costs on this project. We have been previously successful with RED program funding, as mentioned earlier, for the Nith River Promenade, as well as funding towards, I believe, Castle Kilbride repairs, exterior repairs to Castle Kilbride. The funding opportunity, we did look into other opportunities that might be possible. The project that we picked here seemed to be the most appropriate. Staff determined that the pedestrian boardwalk under Highway 78 bridge, which was highlighted within the capital program to be replaced with a permanent concrete surface, made sense. There are photos in the report to show you exactly the shape that it's in right now and the location where it would be. It's a high-use piece of infrastructure that does connect the communities. Again, Morningside seems to be the topic tonight, but Morningside to the downtown core and does help to promote and support economic development within the community. We feel the application that we would put forward is a strong one. The application deadline, as I said, is February 23rd, which is this Thursday. We're seeking council support for staff to put forward the application, which would bring 30% or roughly $66,000 of funding to the municipality. Staff, myself, and staff down the line here are able to answer any questions regarding the project.
Councillor Martin.
Through you, Chair Salonen. Thank you, Director Kelly. My wife and I just walked on that Saturday night, and some people from Morningside invited us for dinner. We came home around 10 p.m. Luckily, the person that we met on the walkway had their own flashlight, and so we assured them that we would not be of any danger to them. Would you consider having lighting as part of this project, or is that already in place?
Through the chair, we can definitely look into costing lighting within this project. That's a good suggestion. We don't typically light trails. However, this one is a little bit different with the active transportation aspect of it. So we can definitely look at that. It would be obviously an added cost.
Thank you. And I guess I think of another day, 2 days before that, where I was walking and it was dusk and there was a person hanging out there. I think it is a safety issue, and so I would certainly recommend. Thank you.
So we would need to pass direction on that if you would like to. So Councillor Martin, are you happy to put that forward as a motion? That
I would put forth a motion that you would add lighting to this project.
Okay. And is that, do we have a seconder? Seconded by Councillor Sadhu. Any questions before we vote on that? Lillian, I just can't see you in case you are motioning. Speak up. Nope. Okay. Great. Then thank you. We will open it to the vote. All of those in favor? And that passes unanimously. Any additional questions then, councillors, on this report? Oh, I'm sorry. Director Jackson.
Through the chair, we would just be looking for direction on costing unless you want me to spend $1 million.
I'm going to go probably pretty confidently and say no on the $1 million. But do we have suggested direction on costing, or would we like staff to bring back their findings? What are we looking for?
I guess through you, Chair Salonen, I'm thinking as inexpensive as possible. I don't even know if it's possible to do a motion sensor kind of lighting. And I think, I mean, lighting after midnight, maybe it doesn't have to be that, but just so that if people are walking back and forth downtown to the other side, I don't know.
I'll pass it over to CAO Chambers.
Through you, Chair, I think what we're suggesting is just that the direction to staff would be to bring back costing on lighting, and then council can make the decision whether they wish to proceed or not.
That works for everyone? Oh, yes.
Just to add on to that, we will have to put a rough estimate of lighting in for the grant application, though, which is getting submitted on Thursday. That might not match what the lighting ends up being, but we'll put a provision in for that.
Dare I say, can we put that up to the discretion of staff? Okay. That's a friendly amendment. It's being accepted as friendly amendment. So as long as nobody has objections, we will leave that as direction to staff. Any final questions then on this report? Councillor Cressman.
Did we need, was that considered the main motion, or did we have a main motion?
There is the main motion as well. So that's just been added as an amendment to it. Any final questions then, councillors? Okay, seeing none, I will now call the vote, which was going to include the amendment of directing staff to add lighting options, including provisionary costing for the grant application. And then in addition, the actual recommendation that report COR 2023-18 regarding Rural Economic Development Fund be received for information, and further that staff be directed to submit an application on behalf of the Township of Wilmot for funding towards the replacement of the pedestrian boardwalk under Highway 78 bridge. All those in favor? Okay, and that passes unanimously. And that brings us to our final item of the evening, which is adjournment. So the recommendation is that we now adjourn our meeting, again, until the call of the mayor. May I please have a mover? Moved by Councillor Martin, seconded by Councillor Wilkinson. All those in favor, and we're adjourned.